Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The book chats feature members of the Berkeley faculty discussing a recently published book and showcase the diversity and creativity of Berkeley's humanities community. Before I turn to today's event, let me call your attention to several upcoming events sponsored by the Townsend Center. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific time, we will celebrate the centenary of the great jazz musician, Charlie Parker, with an event titled After Charlie Parker. This will be moderated by Scott Saul of the English department and will feature Fumio Kiji of the rhetoric department, Jesse Chuy Varela, the music director of KCSM Radio, and jazz educator and musician Marty Ehrlich. They will discuss the various achievements and influences of Charlie Parker's work. Next week, we welcome this year's Avenali Professor in the Humanities, Joy Harjo, the Poet Laureate of the United States. On Wednesday at 4 p.m., we will feature Joy Harjo in conversation with poet and critic Craig Santos Perez, discussing, among other things, the recently published Norton Anthology of Native American Poetry. On Thursday at 4 o'clock, she will be in conversation with Beth Piatot of the Departments of Comparative Literature and Native American Studies at Berkeley, talking about her current work promoting Native American writing. Today's event brings together the practices of philosophy, poetry, translation, and literary criticism. We celebrate the publication by City Lights Books of Under the Dome, the memoir of the distinguished French poet Jean Daive. The book is a record of Daive's long friendship and discussions with the great German language poet Paul Celan. Under the Dome has been translated by the poet and publisher Rosmarie Waldrop, and is introduced and placed in context through a remarkable critical preface by our guests today. Philip Gerard, a Berkeley PhD in comparative literature, is currently research fellow at the Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and will be shortly be taking up a position as lecturer at the ETH in Zurich. Also joining us is Robert Kaufman, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature. Rob is the author of Negative Romanticism, out later this year from Cornell University Press, a book on the aesthetic theories of Theodor Adorno in the context of modern poetry. He's also the author of many influential essays about modern poetry and poetics. Philip and Bob will be in conversation with Anne Smock, Professor Emerita of French at Berkeley, and herself the author of a new book on contemporary poetry titled The Play of Light. Let me remind our audience that you can submit questions to our guests through the chat function. They'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to Anne, Philip, and Rob. Welcome all three.
Well, I think I might be the one to speak first, mainly just to say that I'm really very happy that Rob Kaufman thought of including me in this chat. And I want to go on by saying that it's really been wonderful for me reading Under the Dome again now, and now with your really stimulating introduction. The introduction alerted me to many things in the book that I hadn't known before, or I hadn't noticed, or I hadn't sensed in the same way that I can now, or can at least begin to now, thanks to your introduction. So I'm joining a lot of other people in saying once again an admiring thank you to both of you. I thought I'd go on just a little bit about translation, because your introduction is especially good at describing the practice of translation as a sort of constantly expanding world of exchanges, changes and exchanges, turns and returns from one tongue to another, and crisscrosses too, and doublings back, doublings over. Starting from Rosmarie Waldrop's task here, which is not only translating Daive's French into English, but in the course of that, translating Daive's French translations of Celan's German into French into English. So I I admire very much your descriptions of the multiplicity of relations that seem to be always increasing, a sort of ramifying design of connections like those between Celan, Daive, Rosmarie, Waldrop, the unexpected routes by which poems can sometimes reach a very far away reader, or turn up suddenly in a sort of unexpected place that might be particularly favorable for it, or in which it sounds the same but not quite the same, or different in an important way. So I thought I'd like to invite you to expand a little bit, if you'd like, on this subject of a sort of translating map that stretches out across many boundaries. It's in a phrase that I found very useful and memorable, an everywhere made of many somewheres. I think that's a phrase by Jerome Rothenberg. So that would be my first suggestion, that you might like to sort of start out by elaborating a little bit on that, that translating world, or translating constellation of connections that keeps expanding and has interesting ways of folding back over on itself and so on. Either one.
Maybe you'd like to start.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Anne, for that question. And thanks, Tim and the Townsend Center, for inviting us. This is a real pleasure to be here. But yeah, I too was really struck by that quote from Jerome Rothenberg, an everywhere that's not a nowhere, but a everywhere that's made up of many somewheres. And that's something that he came up with, I think, in a talk that he gave about post-war American poetry, and what he was trying to think about as a kind of new globalism, a new opening of American poetry outwards, beyond the frontiers of the Americas to Europe. And he includes his meeting of Celan in that as well. And it does seem like this text that Daive has given us, with its kind of iterative movement in and around Paris, is really a very particular somewhere, but that as we kind of dig through it and dig through the texts that Daive and Celan are reading and discussing, we realize that, as you say, it's a very ramified particular local place, that there are kind of roots and rhizomes that not only go back to Celan's childhood in Chernovitz in kind of present-day Ukraine, but to Daive's childhood kind of in northern France and in Belgium, and to Prague and Kafka, and then we end up on Patmos. There's all of these specific locations that are all kind of textually knit together, and that this has something important, I think, to do with the process of translation in the text. These kind of circulation of texts also physically. Celan is always giving Daive books that he's translating. They're translating each other. They're passing books back and forth. So yeah, maybe that's where I would start to think about that. It's interesting because Celan is often, if there's anything that people say about Celan, like the big commonplace is that he's untranslatable. And this memoir of Daive's, which is sort of invites us to kind of revisit the genesis of so much of his poetry, and you see that translation is part of the genesis of that poetry, that it's sort of there in the beginning, that there are languages under the language of Celan's poetry, that it's not, that if it's untranslatable, it's because there's too much to translate. There's too many languages circulating.
Would you like to go ahead in your own direction with this question, or I hope sometime we can come back to talk a little bit about untranslatableness, or what is untranslatable, or what that, but it might be that Rob would like to have something to say at this point about the travels of Celan throughout the world beyond Europe and the United States.
I think that, thanks, Anne, and thanks, Philip, for that. I think one of the things among many that made Philip and me feel so thrilled to be able to participate in putting together this new edition with City Lights, and particularly with Garrett Caples and Elaine Katzenberger and Peter Maravellis there, is that City Lights had a very crucial role in the late 1950s in being the press in the English-speaking world, and especially the United States, that first brought Celan into print within the spine of a book. And their dedication to wanting to bring back into print Jean Daive's memoir of his work with Celan between 1965 and 1970, and all of its aftermaths, gave us a chance to link why that project to Ferlinghetti and City Lights in the first place was so important. And it's a related notion of translation, of being unsatisfied with what was then a Cold War consensus. It happened to be that during that war, while in the US Army in West Germany, Jerry Rothenberg, as a very young poet, met Celan. And the sort of things that Philip was just bringing up and that Anne was talking about, and of course, the whole aftermath of fascism, of the genocide, but also of a very new world situation, made the press feel that it wanted to get the work out. And one of the things that Philip and I were trying to trace in the introduction was how rapidly and in certain ways unpredictably Celan's work, and then dialogues with it almost immediately, got to Latin America, the Caribbean, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in Martinique, in relation to generations of poets that in some sense begin with the importance of Aimé Césaire, and more explicitly and more recently all the way to a poet like Manchouachi. It gets into African-American discourse, into figures in North American poetry also at the same time, like Robert Duncan. A little bit later, Michael Palmer becomes a very important figure. And the back and forth between poets who are making poetry and translating it. Rosmarie, Waldrop, of course, Norma Cole, and others, winds up creating a set of communities that are interested in putting the work out. So we became really interested in the way the difficulties inside Celan's poetry itself actually seemed to beckon to being about social, political questions and problems that were nothing if not difficult, but that obviously needed to find forms to be addressed and to be shared. And as imperfect and problematic as it always is, that inevitably begins across borders with translation.
Mm-hmm. This might be a good moment to say something about Jean Daive himself as a person who has really done a lot to cultivate and sustain this multiple community or web of connections, and to have opened up the possibility of connections sometimes that might very well have remained impossible, or there might very well have encountered difficult or insuperable obstacles. But so I wondered if maybe it would be a way of talking about Jean Daive as a person who is in a way a kind of intermediary, not only from one language to another, or that certainly, or from one part of the world to another, or from one moment in time or in history to another, but also just between thoughts or ways of thinking that might have difficulty communicating, but that he seems to have sometimes been able to introduce possible conversations, exchanges. Yeah.
I'd like to start, Philip. I'll try and think of myself as well, but I don't want to push you if you're not ready.
I mean, maybe you could begin with maybe some of the details about Jean Daive's role as a kind of center, a publisher, someone who brings people together, I think.
Sure. One of the things I take it that Anne is alluding to and asking us to talk about is a series of roles, none of which are him in the entirety, that Jean Daive in his life and work as a poet, as a radio producer, as an editor, as a translator, wound up playing and still playing. And I think in his mind, and perhaps the mind of the world, and rightly so, above all as a poet. But when he first met Celan in 1965, he was a young person in his 20s and trying to find his way in the world and in art. And I think one of the things that was so generative for us about going back to this memoir, which is also something like a poetic meditation, and at points feels almost like it's got pages of prose poem character to it. One senses that all that he became was hardly given at the start, hardly could have been predicted. And in his interactions with Celan, whether it was there from the start or coaxed out of him in part by their friendship and their collaboration as two translators and poets translating one another, Daive has always had an astonishing ear for all kinds of work, and remarkably work that's not necessarily like his own. An incredibly generous editor and collator and gatherer of poets across languages, across styles, across forms. I think what that's made possible also is for things that he catches in his own poetry from other poets or that come from himself to grab onto the ears of readers, some of whom may be poets, in very unexpected and catalytic ways. One of the very famous and yet still not well enough known incidents of that we try to talk about in the introduction is right near what she didn't know would be the end of her life. Rosmarie Waldrop read the first English translation of Jean Daive's first published book, which was a book-length poem in French, Décimale Blanche, white decimal.
Rob,
Which,
excuse
I'm sorry.
I think you meant Lorraine Niedecker, because you said
I'm sorry.
Rosmarie Waldrop.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Who's alive and well, and
Yeah.
Thanks for catching that. Apologies, Rosmarie. I didn't mean to take you away from us. On the contrary, I meant to say Lorraine Niedecker. And I think all I'll finish by saying at the moment is that Lorraine Niedecker found Sid Corman's translation in Sid Corman's journal Origin of Daive's first book, book-length poem, and read it, and it felt to her like it had changed her life and given her a new road into what she felt blocked by certain political strictures that she had politically adopted on the left, but that were really blocking her writing, and that in a certain sense came to her out of her relationship in various ways with Zhukovsky and others. Daive has had that effect on many people, that is to remind them of paths that they didn't know were there but could be discovered, to finding their own work in the work of others. Thanks, Anne, for the correction.
I just want to intervene for a sec before listening to Philip, because this story about Lorraine Niedecker and Celan is so interesting to me. So I just tell it a little bit further. It's in the introduction. I tell it a little bit further than Rob told it, because it seems that Niedecker herself died before she'd been able to pursue this new sort of impulse that she felt she'd to write again, that she felt she'd received from reading in Sid Corman's translation, Jean Daive's Décimale Blanche. She died too soon, but Daive learned about her and her interest in his work, and he became interested in her and found out about her and wrote a book about her called Une femme à quelques vies. And one or the other of you, or both of you together in the introduction, suggests that in this book by Daive about Noreen Niedecker, you can sort of hear something like what Noreen Niedecker would have sounded like had she been French. And I find this, it's a mysterious and startling thing that I sense can sometimes happen in translation, or in the sort of work of translation, or the kinds of exchanges and odd encounters and bends in time and stuff that can happen in translation, that suddenly you hear a voice that could not be attributed to anyone who ever existed. But yet you hear it, or you sense it somehow. And it reminds me of what I take to be, anyway, the pleasure that Emmanuel Ocar takes in translation, which is that sometimes in a translation you can hear something that only no one would have said. So, and I'm sure that both of you have plenty of things to say and thoughts about these sort of odd shocks that can occur in the course of translating work. But I think we might have still to pursue a little bit further the character of Jean Daive's career, and also of his poetry, because at the same time that it's I've learned from you the real importance and of his presence as a sort of intermediary, making certain things available between times, people, and so on, that might just have been gone by the wayside without him. So thinking of him as this sort of in-between, intermediary, liminal person, helping communication on both sides of a distance. But then also I was struck in reading some of his work that he has this line in which he insists the bridges are all burned. All the bridges are burned. And in fact, he says the poem has burned the bridges. So it seems to me striking, that sort of insistence at both this at the same time, that you can make absolutely the most unlikely connections. You can retrieve them or open them, but at the same time, there's something going on in thinking and writing and so on that it stops communication, that cuts the link.
Maybe I could say something a little bit about that. I mean, I think that tension or binary or maybe dialectic is something really structuring in this text, and also just for me now, generally thinking about Celan and Daive. I mean, Daive, for me at least, is a poet who is so kind of invested in transmission, in the radio, in editing and publishing other poets, in carrying forward Celan's legacy. And Celan is often thought of as someone incredibly isolated, someone for whom all the bridges have been burned. And it seems like their relationship begins to suggest that maybe the opposition is not quite as clear-cut as we think, that these moments of cutting and of silence, the bridges that collapse, are also opportunities for language to spark differently. There's all of these kind of metaphors about electrical switches turning off and on, and silence working as a switch, or the movement between two languages being a kind of switch. In some ways, making us think differently about this one or the other, translatable, not translatable, transmissible, not transmissible. I mean, that's what I really take out of Daive's memoir. But another way, I guess, also just to think about this, that there's this language of switching, of code switching, of moving between languages, of translations. But then there's also really important for Celan and for Daive too, is this presence of death, of spectrality, of haunting, and that translation is a kind of haunting. The kind of presence of another text under your own text. There are moments in Daive's memoir where he just kind of begins, without marking it as such, to translate Celan's poetry. And that's really interesting too. Yeah.
Would this be a moment that we might introduce this Robert Duncan poem that includes a line, "It is totally untranslatable"? I mean, I sense that that remembering that poem might invite you to say a little more about a sort of strange relation between on and off, or yes and no, or possible and impossible, or I just remind us all of the poem a little bit. I only learned about it some time ago through Rob Kaufman, so I've always felt glad about that. But it's called, I also, another reason I bring it up is because it has to do with Celan. It's called A Song from the Structures of Rhyme, Ringing as the Poet Paul Celan Sings. And right in the middle, it has this line that says, "It is totally untranslatable." And I mean, I sort of make bold to suggest that this is just how I, for the moment, sort of understand the words of the poem, that it is totally untranslatable. It is the possibility of no thing so being there. Those are two other lines of the poem. The possibility of no thing so being there. That's what I take to be it being totally untranslatable. And it just occurs to me that it is untranslatable because it is its own translation already. That it is yes translating no, and vice versa, no translating yes, unstoppably, something, nothing, being nothing, being there. But that the poem is just always doing and undoing itself, or turning itself over, translating itself all the time. And that's why that's what it means to say it is untranslatable. It's just a thought I thought of suggesting in the context, of what's impossible in translation, but which doesn't just seem to be simply the opposite of possibilities and movement and meetings and conversations and so on.
That's really nice. There's a quote by George Steiner about Celan, where he says that all of Celan's poetry, all of his own poetry, has been translated into German. Which, like, on a certain level, I think is profoundly correct. But it's also always all of his own poetry has been translated out of German, and there's this kind of movement in and out that I think that you're getting at, Anne. Which I think is so important for Celan's poetry and maybe for Daive's as well. Rob, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, not at all. I was really grateful for what you just said, Philip. And Duncan wrote that poem during an extended visit to Paris in 76 and 77, when he was hosted by essentially the group of French poets that your great new book is about. And above all, Emmanuel Ocard, who published that poem in English in Paris in a very limited edition, just that one poem as a chapbook. And Duncan was surrounded by people who had known Celan. He'd been reading Celan for years before that. He first read Celan in Jerry Rothenberg's English translation in 1959, but he'd gotten his hands on all the translations and had tried as well as he could also to read him in German and in French translation. That poem's a double sonnet, as if trying twice to get to what it's realizing as it completes itself. Can't ever come up with any perfection, let alone equivalent. And the question that needs to be faced is relationality, rather than some core that's finally reached that is just it or the thing. And in notebook markings and jottings around the same time and afterwards about that poem and those issues, Duncan, although he couldn't have known it, sounds remarkably like what Philip and I, just at one point in the introduction, quote Jean Daive as hearing at a remarkable moment at a cafe in Paris, working next to Celan, when Celan talks about what poetry needs to do to get at not necessarily unknown historical trauma. He's obviously in the first place thinking of the genocide during the Second World War, but it's hardly limited to that. And he says that the English translation is, the poem needs to achieve a scorching availability. And availability in the sense of something that one feels one cannot refrain from going to once it's heard, seen, felt. And yet the pleasure in it is of knowing something that isn't yet known and is very difficult and obviously painful to know. Something like that, and something like the echoes of Celan's line about the grave in the air from Death Fugue, Todesfuge, is also circulating at the same time, and it keeps doing so. We were very struck that in the epigraph to her first, not her first book, but one of the first books that got her extremely and rightly well known, Claudia Rankine's Don't Let Me Be Lonely, an American lyric. The epigraph is from Aimé Césaire, and the lines she quotes are about his reference to this sea of grief, which many interpreters think of as gorgeously metaphorical. It may be, but it's also about the Middle Passage and all the bodies of Africans in that sea taken. And there's a resonance that a lot of poets reading Rankine experience, and not least because in that book, she comes back as in musical cadence to Celan. He's something like the penultimate movement in the book. Those moments were ways, I think, that gave Philip and I of thinking about the social registers of translatability and untranslatability, with untranslatability not meaning don't touch, but rather don't assume that you already know what it is that you're trying to engage. And I think moments like that, as well as Manchwashi, the Colombian sculptor Doris Salcedo, thinking about Celan a lot in her physical art, in sculptural work and installations that are also trying to move within that tension. The Chilean poet Raúl Zurita and others that we only had a brief moment in the introduction to bring in and try to, I think, are all thinking inside that problem, Anne, that you're bringing up about what if something is untranslatable, and that's a sign to keep going rather than to just give up.
It's also, oh, sorry.
I mean, I can't help just kind of tacking on to this more onto the kind of Claudia Rankine side, the reference that Rankine makes to Celan and don't let me be lonely. What's interesting about there too is that she kind of makes it explicit, the relevance of Celan, because she's comparing the way that Celan's talking about the reemergence of speech after the Shoah, as a kind of emerging from all of this silence of death-bringing speech. And she's talking about Mahalia Jackson and African-American spiritual music as emerging through a similar kind of sea of death-bringing speech. And I was, which is one thing in very important to keep in mind. But I interestingly saw, was like looking through some of Celan's letters, and there's a letter from like 46 to this Dutch singer that I think he was dating at the time, Diet Kloes Barendrank. And he's talking about the L'Abbé, the Gordon Heath's club in the left bank, which is like not far from the Contrescarpe where all of this memoir takes place. And he's talking about going there to listen to Gordon Heath play this spiritual music. And he has these kind of profound connections precisely over these tunes like Climbing Jacob's Ladder and stuff. And even at one point he's talking about hearing strange fruit in this cafe after the war, and turning around and realizing that he's like sitting across from, it turns out to be this Norwegian guy who speaks German, but who he learns was a collaborator. And this is a kind of another instance where it was this kind of a availability that's scorching, because he's listening to strange fruit and making this connection with his own experience, and he's also watching this Nazi collaborator enjoy and applaud Gordon Heath's performance. It's a fascinating moment of kind of transatlantic connection. And
it's really fascinating to hear that, and then to just keep thinking about the various moments of poems that we're all relating them to. That particular page on Claudia Rankine's book with the image of Mahalia Jackson there, and her as an embattled figure, misunderstood by those not willing to enter into what her work and her art were about. Not only is it appearing in dialogue on that same page with Rankine's decision to quote from Celan and talk about the Celan, but it's also implicit for at least some of her readers at that point. Besides the voice, the song, the art, politically, there are many, many things she did, but what she may be most famous for is the moment in '63 where King, during the speech at the monument, hadn't yet said, and she calls out, "Martin, tell them about the dream." And all of that is embedded there. And I'm just thinking about the way it cross-relates to what you're bringing up, Philip, of a moment inside another space across the water, but also of music, of the political questions, and of the poetry as well.
It seems good to emphasize the way in both your reflections you emphasize the multiplicity of connections among times and people and experiences that could seem improbable. And your comments both emphasize the impressiveness and sort of stirring character of the fact that they do, the connections, but at the same time, you keep present to my mind, following you anyway, the sort of horrible collisions that this involves also, and really awful grating of one thing against another, or ripping and tearing also in the whole map of somewheres. it seems important that the way you talk about it makes a person listening to you sense very strongly both things at once, or both aspects or dimensions of the thing at once.
I think just briefly, for me, you, Anne, put it so powerfully when you brought up that image of the poem burning the bridge, which sounds like a severing of ties, but at least in the way we were reading Daive writing that line, it's something like trying to say that what the history, I'm sort of paraphrasing another poet, David Marriott, a poet and critic, what the history needs to find, but I'm also paraphrasing Philip, is not some quick rush to redemption and triumph, but actually to finding the loss that's been kept from all too many people. The experience of the loss and even the awareness of what the loss itself is. And that image of the poem doing a burning is less a severing of ties than saying the road hasn't been there, and the act of making that that conflagration is itself a sign of what's been lost. And as it were, that one gathers is why Celan uses the image of scorching. It's the challenge to say, does one want to look at what is scorching and to go into it?
Yeah, so I think all those sentences of yours bear on the possibly tired old worry of loss in translation, what's lost in translation. But you're suggesting, I think, a strong and different way of hearing that phrase, hearing the phrase lost in translation, or lost, what's lost in translation.
There's an extended, sorry.
Please.
Go ahead. I was actually going to turn it over to Philip. I was going to say, Anne, there, as you know, there's an extended moment of several pages in the introduction that really is Philip's work and his ability to read Daive thinking about when translation can signify loss. And I'd rather just turn it over to Philip, if he feels like it, to talk about what that means in the context of Daive translating just one line from Celan's poetry, and then Rosmarie Waldrop trying to figure out how to bring all of that over into English.
What's the best way to say this? I mean, it's a story about a translation of a verse from Engführung, which is a poem that Celan wrote after Todesfuge, and notoriously difficult to translate. And Daive had worked on his translation with Celan, who kind of authorized it. But the beginning, the line in question, it begins like "verbracht ins Gelände," which means something like kind of displaced into the terrain. But Daive, in his translation, kind of does something interesting. He kind of treats French as if it was German, more German than German, because he takes this word déporté, which has already in French this much more so than in English. When you speak about la déportation in French, you're speaking about the Shoah. And he takes this word and he cuts it in two. So you have dé and porté, which is actually not what's happening in the German, because the German word is not one of those famous compositas. So he's doing something to the French that is particularly German, doing something to French morphology that's particularly German, but it's not actually mirroring in any direct way what's happening in the anything that's happening in the German. But what's so interesting and what makes this test so rich is that there's also this this thinking about the dice, and the dice in French is the dé, and the throw of the dice. And this is this also is a question of loss, about the poem that's thrown kind of to the wind, and that this is all somehow being played through the translation, that the translation is itself a kind of deportation into the other language, but a deportation that's sort of essential to the original meaning. I mean, the original meaning is about the displacement, is about the loss of speech, it's about being carried across a border in some way, and that the translation, in a way, is assuming this. And then Rosmarie Waldrop's translation into English is, you can imagine how difficult this becomes with all these compounding translations. But her question is like, well, what does she do now? Does she go back and does she translate the German, go back to Celan's German and translate that, or use another of the many English translations of it that exist? Or does she translate Daive's French, and what would that mean? And what I find so interesting about her decision is that she actually doesn't translate the French, but she doesn't translate the French, I would argue, because it's no longer kind of unambiguously French. It's already a French that's been chopped in half by German. There's always already the trace of the German in the French. So it is one of these situations of untranslatability, but not because the original is the perfect. At this point, the original becomes such a problematic term, but it's not because there's like a perfect adequation in the original, but rather because the original is already en route, it's already been displaced. And just throughout the whole text, there's many, many moments like this. This is really one of those texts where they gain by being read in translation, but gain also in this ambivalent way, where what you gain is a further appreciation of the loss, in a way that this is all about, the kind of mourning of his friend who's died, of Celan, who's killed himself, Celan's mourning of his own family and parents, Daive's own losses that he's mourning. So yeah.
I'm wondering if I might not leap in, at least step in briefly, because we're getting close to the end of the hour, and I want to make sure that people who are listening and watching out there in Zoom land have the opportunity to weigh in with any questions or comments they might have. We do have one question already from Meryl Siegel, who points out in passing the importance of catastrophe for both Celan and Rankine, but she actually has a specific question, which is, why, she says, I'm interested in why Celan was so frustrated often with the way his poems were received. Could you talk a bit about that, and especially the issues he had with German readings and critiques? So does anybody want to sort of weigh in on that?
Philip, do you feel like you might like to start on that? And I'll jump in as well, perhaps.
I mean, it's an excellent question. It's the right question to ask. And Celan was incredibly disappointed with the way that he was received in Germany for a lot of reasons. But I think that mostly one of the large ones was to get back to this, the poem is a kind of availability that is scorching, and that many German readers were not ready to approach the flames like that Celan became a way of reconciling themselves with the past, that he, as opposed to opening up those wounds. I think that's how he perceived his reception, that he was being used to close down, thinking about the history of the Shoah and not to excavate it. But Rob, maybe you.
Really, just echoing what you just said, Philip, the most famous, but by no means the only really important example. All of the poetry is arguably the example, but the poem Death Fugue or Todesfuge, he felt with very good reason. Over the years, I've had quite a number of visiting German students of varying ages tell me that their parents and then they themselves had more than glimpses of this experience. The reading of the poem in middle school, high school, for example, Death Fugue, is something like atonement and now we're okay. Something like, let's say, the most automatic observance by white people of Black History Month in a way that would suggest now everything's okay. And Celan felt that acutely, and also felt that it was obviously a case where the art he was making was to try to get at what wasn't even open yet, ready to, far from ready to be reconciled. And the questioner, I think, is very much on target with asking about this in contemporary African-American poetry. Claudia Rankin is the person that was mentioned, but I think around the world among Black poets, but also among poets all trying to raise present and historical questions about what doesn't have to be in terms of necessary poetic subject, but what poets do often choose when they want to get to something that is very pressing and not yet adequately addressed. Such are the things that the art very often goes to and is refused in the guise very often of being accepted. At least that was the way Celan looked at it, and others have as well.
So we have another question here. This is from Steffi Lang, and this was a question that I had wondered about as well, which is could you say a little bit about the presence of Gisèle Celan in the text? Because she plays a really important part. She pops in and out all the time and at crucial moments.
Rob, do you want to?
I'd be happy to, but please, Philip, if you have thoughts as well. I think before turning over to Philip, a few years ago, and just before she passed away, one of the poets in the circle of poets that Anne's great new book, The Play of Light, is about, Anne-Marie Albiach, had my partner Norma Cole and I over to her place. And one of the things I was doing a little, I hope not, but probably obnoxiously and over officiously, was trying to talk to and really interview some of the older French poets who had known Celan bluntly while they were still around. And I was asking her about what she thought was the relationship of Celan, but also Gisèle Celan, to her work, to the work of those around her, and in terms of the question that Steffi Lang is asking, to Celan's own poetry. And we were facing Anne-Marie at the table, and she said, "Oh, she's right there, always behind, just right there behind." And I nodded gravely and assumed she was saying something really interesting and profound and symbolic. Her presence is there always as a ghost. And she said, "Stop nodding, turn around." And I thought, this is going to be really weird. There's going to be a poltergeist of Gisèle Celan, but it wasn't that at all. I turned around, and on the wall was one of Gisèle Celan's lithographs. She was a graphic artist, a brilliant graphic artist. And it was just maybe one way into the question that was just asked of the interchange of their art and of their life was really unceasing. Philip, I think you have lots more to say. Please feel free to jump in on this.
I mean, if people out there in the internet land are not familiar with Gisèle Celan's work, Celan's wife's work, you should definitely Google it. It's extremely, extremely interesting. She's a really great visual artist. And I think that the relationship of her engravings to Celan's poetry is an important one, where birth, something that I think Daive was also very attuned to at the time. I mean, if you read the memoir, you will notice much of the text is kind of overshadowed by these branches of these trees, this canopy of trees that they walk under up and down these avenues in Paris. And if you look at Giselle's sketch engravings, you'll see a similar kind of branching, striated, forked movement that kind of resembles sometimes letters or tears or something. And I think that there's something important about Giselle as a kind of mediating figure between Daive and Celan, and this other medium that's not writing, but is maybe a kind of shadow cast by the writing, is important too.
So it looks like we have one. We're going to have to. I'm just informing us all that we're going to have to really end right on the hour, if not a little bit before, because Professor Smock has to teach. Unlike some of us, she actually has a job. So so we have one more question. This is from Matthew Evans, who says he'd like to hear more about Daive and what Daive gets from Celan in Decimale Blanche and how this opens things up poetically for Niedecker. So could you expand a little bit more on that?
It's about a 5-hour rather than a 50-second question. It's a great question. I'll just say, and very, very quickly, so that perhaps Philip can say just a few words as well. The very schematic way I think to put it is that Daive is sort of one generation after Celan, whom as a 25-year-old he's learning from. Yet another inheritor with marked differences from partly surrealist traditions of experimenting in what might be thought of as lyric that is always pushing boundaries, and far from being a stable lyric eye, sort of understands the genre as the exploration of inner relation and the possibility of things dissolving. That was very threatening, Niedecker perceived always, to her close confidant, partner, lover, colleague, Louis Zukowski, formally, and perhaps in certain ways within the left, politically as well. And she often felt that he was, for decades, trying to push it away from her. And when she encountered Daive's work in '69, it was again an explosion of, it's not that I need to imitate this, this reminds me of what I can permit myself to do. And she wrote quite a bit about that in letters, and letters that are almost the beginnings of certain movements towards poems. And as they say, unfortunately, then she died. It also happened to be within months of Celan's suicide, same year.
As they say on NPR, Philip, in less than a minute. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, maybe it's a way to plug the book, but so important for Celan is this, named one of his, a poem in a volume. It's this idea of a Sprachgitter. So it's like a grill of speech, or it's like a grate that you speak through. And this is an idea that had legs and that resonates with Daive's own poetics and with the form of Decimale Blanche as well. And it's one of these moments, this idea of a speech grid or a great kind of a spatialization of language that connects with a lot of kind of other movements in post-war Europe and post-war America, ideas for language poetry, all these different ways of giving yourself rules to work with that are not really Celan. It's different from Celan's, but this idea of a speech grid that gets kind of spatialized and laid flat is important for both. It's one of those liminal moments where Daive and Celan kind of exchange a jolt of electricity and something special happens.
Fantastic. Speaking of jolts of electricity, this was a wonderful conversation. Our thanks to all three of you. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon, hopefully tomorrow afternoon for the discussion of Charlie Parker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.